Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today as always. Happy Christmas Eve Eve. Amber, how you doing? How many Eves can we do?
I think you got it right. 2 Eves.
How you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm excited for Christmas.
Me too. I feel like I'm trying to get all the way in the holiday spirit, but it's slowly coming. I mean, it's here.
It's hard when you're working up to really the final moment, but I'm starting to feel it. I love the decorations we have on set. I think we're getting close.
Okay, we're almost there.
Coming up on Rising, we're going to talk about the exodus of staffers from the Heritage Foundation. They are heading to former Vice President Mike Pence's think tank, marking the latest shakeup for the organization that has become the center of the conversation about a, quote, conservative civil war over the past few months.
Also, we'll get into CBS News' Barry Weiss' decision not to air a story about the Trump administration deporting migrants to his El Salvador prison, CCOT.
But first, Lindsay, what's in your lens?
Yeah, let's talk about it. So, Elise Stefanik, she didn't just drop out of New York's governor's race. She walked away from the entire political bet she's been making for years. On paper, her exit came wrapped in familiar language: family, timing, strategy. In a post on X, Stefanik pointed to a potentially bruising primary and wrote that, quote, "As we have seen in past elections, while we would have overwhelmingly won this primary, it's not an effective use of our time or your generous resources to spend the first half of next year in an unnecessary and protracted Republican primary, especially in a challenging state like New York." Now, Stefanik was already facing long odds. Democrats outnumber Republicans 2-1 in New York, and the state hasn't elected a Republican governor in more than 2 decades. A midterm election year wasn't likely to help, but structural math is not what ended this campaign. Power dynamics did. For years, Stefanik built her political identity around proximity to Donald Trump. She reshaped herself, branded herself a, quote, ultra MAGA, and played the loyalist role with discipline. That loyalty, she believed, would pay off. Well, it didn't. After Trump yanked her nomination to serve as UN ambassador, publicly undercut her, and then declined to endorse her for governor, the message was unmistakable, and it landed hard. In a long post on X, she wrote, in part, "My most important title is mom." That line matters not because it's insincere, but because it's the soft landing after a series of very public political blows. Donors were left frustrated, allies confused, and Stefanik herself appeared for the first time politically untethered. To critics, this moment felt like consequence. Representative Don Beyer, a Democrat of Virginia, put it bluntly to the New York Times a year ago, quote, "My greatest disappointment is Elise Stefanik, who should know better. She went off the deep end." What Stefanik's fall really crystallizes is the ceiling of MAGA loyalty. Trump can elevate you overnight. He can also leave you stranded just as fast. And he doesn't have to explain himself either way. That became an unavoidable reality during one of the most striking moments of this saga, involving New York City Mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani. Stefanik attempted to make Mamdani the face of the far left, even referring to him as a, quote, jihadist. But when Trump was asked to back her up, standing right beside Mamdani after their Oval Office meeting, he didn't just refuse, he dismissed the attack and told a reporter, quote, "You really have to ask her about that. I met with a man who was a very rational person." That was a political gut punch. Stefanik's story isn't just about one race or endorsement. It's about what happens when a political career is built around a single gravitational force. When that force moves on, you're left scrambling to explain the wreckage. Now, in Trump's orbit, loyalty isn't rewarded, it's rented. And when the lease is up, sometimes you don't even get a goodbye. So we were talking about this a little bit yesterday, which is why I wanted to do this from my lens, because everybody's like, what the heck? Like, she just kind of dropped out of the race. So I want to know your perspective. So I dived into it. And the biggest thing for me was that when Elise Stefanik got into New York politics back in 2014, she was considered, well, first, she was the youngest person at the time to get into Congress and considered a very moderate candidate. And so around 2018, around the time that Trump started really being taken very seriously as the face of the Republican Party, she started to align herself more and more. And I understand a lot of people, from tech companies to individuals to politicians, have done the same thing. But she leaned all the way in, coining herself the ultra MAGA person. And she did all these different things. And it's like the way that the president decides who is worth supporting and who's not. And he looks at his odds. He hates losing. And we know that historically. He won't support a candidate that probably even has more than a 10% chance of losing a race because he doesn't want to go down as a line with losers. And so there's so much that was happening in just this race, but then also her nomination being pulled because of the incidents that happened a few months ago. And it's kind of like a lot of things have happened to her in her relationship with President Trump that she probably didn't have planned, when a lot of people had respected her prior to that, just resting on her laurels and just saying what she actually wants to do and accomplish and kind of pushing forward in that way. She didn't need to do all this to get this outcome. People have done far less for aligning themselves with President Trump, like J.D. Vance, and seemingly have gone further. I mean, we know that Vance has been very critical of the president prior to being on his team, and that doesn't seem to be a problem. We know that Marjorie Taylor Greene had a long leash with the president, and then both of them just kind of let go of each other. But like, why does she feel like taking this route and then to be left with this end result doesn't seem worth, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze?
Yeah, there's a lot going on here. So if we go back to 2016, as you mentioned, she was a very moderate member of Congress, sort of center-right, and she often declined to speak about the president specifically when he was running in the Republican primary and even in the general. She eventually kind of halfway got on board saying, well, I support the Republican nominee, but she wouldn't say Trump's name. Then after he assumes the presidency, she ends up becoming a rather vocal supporter. And then her profile gets elevated in the past couple of years with her criticisms of alleged anti-Semitic protest on college campuses, which leverages her to be the UN ambassador nominee. But I think there's more to the story about why that ambassadorship nomination was pulled, because the explanation that Trump gave was he was worried about a special election in her district. But she's in a R+10 district. This is presumably a pretty safe Republican seat. And from what I understand, based on the timing of staffers moving up to New York City and getting prepared.
There's tea.
We've reported this at the Daily Caller, but staffers were moving up to New York City, getting prepared for her first big session at the UN. And after their bags were packed and they were on the road was when Trump made this shock announcement that he was pulling the nomination because of the concerns about keeping the seat. And so I think maybe there was some underlying bad blood there about how that all shook out. And then most recently, she got into a public spat with Speaker Mike Johnson about the NDAA, right. And Trump was apparently the person who moderated the phone call between those two to try to tamp down the public sort of blood spilling between those two. And so I think there is probably a little bit more attention than has been publicly reported between Stefanik and Trump. And then you enter Bruce Blakeman into the New York gubernatorial primary, who's a good friend of Trump. They've been friends for a long time. People were saying that they had a closer relationship than Trump and Stefanik did. They're golf buddies. And so Trump says, you know, I think they're both great candidates. I don't want to choose who to endorse. And Stefanik is kind of looking back at what happened with Lee Zeldin. He had to spend a bunch of money on what was really an uncompetitive primary when he ran for New York governor. And you don't want to spend all of that money in the primary race when you have a very uphill battle in the general in a state that is very blue. So I understand the reasoning there, where if you're not going to get the Trump endorsement secured before the general election, that maybe strategically it's not the wisest to stay in the race. But I just suspect, based on this series of events, that there's probably some greater tension sort of bubbling under the surface between those two.
And there also is that whole big thing that, like, we keep talking about, we're going to talk about more today, is like what happens after President Trump. So if your entire mission statement has gone from moderate Republican to complete ally of President Trump, well, after his name's not on the ballot, what does that mean for you? And since she's done, like, what do we do next with policy-wise or legacy when she has no positioning now in government? Like, what are your next steps? And then you can't, like, let's say somebody who's more a Pence-like candidate or even more traditional conservative, like the Bush era comes into power next. Then how does Elise Stefanik fit in that if you've already proclaimed that you're ultra, quote, MAGA?
Yeah, I'm curious to see what she does next. Maybe she's kind of hedging her bets on a presidential run. Who knows? But looks like Bruce Blakeman now is apparently going to be
and
the
Trump
Republican
did throw his
nominee.
support behind him.
That's right. Almost immediately after Stefanik dropped out, too. Up next, staffers at the Heritage Foundation are leaving to team up with former Vice President Mike Pence. Lindsey mentioned him. We'll have more on that after the break.